Welcome to this episode of Theology Matters. I am so thankful that theology isn't just for academics or the professional ministerial credentials, but theology shapes all of our understanding of God. It guides our spiritual formation and discipleship and gives us depth to lead people into the things of God. You know, every Christian is called to know God and to be able to account for the hope that's within them. Our testimony isn't just about what God has done for us, but about what that means for other people. And that takes good theology. So theology does matter. Today we're going to talk about one of the most foundational Christian doctrines and one of the most important for navigating contemporary culture. It's our doctrine of humanity. To have that conversation, I'm delighted to welcome back the Assemblies of God Theological Counsel, Dr. Alan Tennison. Thanks for being here, Doc.
Thank you, Pastor Doug, for the invitation to this important conversation.
Now, that's interesting. You don't usually say important conversation. Why would you frame this as such an important conversation?
I would say it's important because so many of our cultural debates today, in fact, maybe I should say it's important because it's relevant. So many of our important cultural debates today really results from the confusion over what it means to be human. So we're confused over ethical debates regarding life. So in regards to, say, abortion, we'll sometimes talk about when does life begin? Life begins at conception. That's not really the question. Of course, life begins at conception. Something's growing inside of you. That's life. The question is, at what point is that a human person? When does human being begin? When does human personhood begin? Same question with euthanasia. When does a human person end? It is at the end of their biological life, or is it at the end of their biographical life? Some people who argue for, assisted suicide say, look, once the biographical life is over, really this is the end of the human person. This debate extends to debates about gender and sexuality. To what extent does our physical body determine our identity, our sexual identity? To what extent does it serve as a boundary for that? Even debates today about politics and economics. Is the value of a human person purely utilitarian? It's what they can do for others. Or people simply cogs in a machine? Does someone, say, in a political sense, have rights even if they're not a citizen of a particular country? What is intrinsic to them as simply being a human person? So all of these debates in our culture really come down to how do we understand what it means to be human? Now, if all of these debates go back to that, then it goes back to the idea of what the value or worth of a human being is and how that actually shapes our behavior. So how do we treat ourselves? How do we treat others? And for Christians, this goes back to what the Bible teaches us about being human.
So how does understanding of what it means to be human lead to the understanding of what's human being? I mean, isn't our value infinite?
I used to do this kind of fun experiment for my class when we discuss what it means to be human. And I would ask them, let's begin with human value. Could we put a price tag on human value? One ethicist has said this. He said, if you say human value is infinite for one person, then it would be the same value as it would be for 1 million people. And yet we still think 1 million people is more valuable than one person. So he said, how do you weigh this? So I'd say to my students, let's look at this. And here's it's a thought experiment. Let's say that we dissolved you down to all the chemicals that make up your body. And so here's the oxygen that makes you up, here's the hydrogen that makes you up, the nitrogen, the calcium, the carbon, whatever. And then let's say, what is that worth on the open market? And I'd say, just from that, how much do you think you're worth?
I'm afraid to guess on that.
Well, the numbers are kind of hard to nail down, but I've heard some go as low as $5, some go as high as $200.
Yeah, but one of our vital organs is obviously a whole lot more valuable than $200.
Okay, so let's look at the value of our bodies based on our body parts or contributions. If I was to cut you up into all the pieces I could sell on the open market, and I'm sorry that this sounds so much like a serial killer, but just go with me. If I was able to do that, how much money could I get for your individual parts? So consider the price of eggs or sperm over the course of a lifetime. Consider how much your blood is worth, your plasma is worth. Consider vital organs like kidneys or heart, your cornea, your bones, especially your bone marrow. And some have argued that if you put all that together, we're actually going to be worth in the millions of dollars. So we go from the chemical composition, $200, to now being worth millions of dollars. So my joke was always, if someone tells you you look like $1 million, they're actually undervaluing you.
Yeah, okay, I get that. But we don't value human beings based on the market price for parts of their body. That's wrong. That's not even spiritual.
Yeah, and of course, one of the reasons it's wrong takes us back to the Bible, because we used to sell human beings based on the value of their bodies. And it's scripture that helped lead us to that place culturally to say we can't value human beings the way God does and treat them this way. But let me give you another example, because I still want to stick with a number here. Financial payouts are sometimes given in the case of someone's accidental death based on the monetary value of that person's production over the amount of assumed years they had left. So you look at what someone was making per year, how many more years could they have made that? And that sometimes serves as the financial payout for the family. So for example, the 9/11 Victim Compensation Fund received $7 billion to pass out to the families of 3,000 victims. And they had to decide how to divide that $7 billion to 3,000 families. And what they eventually based it on was the unequal lifetime earnings of each victim. So, for example, the families of firefighters who rushed into the building could receive less than the families of the stockbrokers those firefighters rushed in to save, because it's based on what they were earning. Wow. And this was, of course, debated by a lot of families who felt like it was unfair. The head of the fund was actually grilled on this by ABC News, and he gave this interesting response. And here's what he said. And I'm going to do this in quotes. This is his quote. "It is a brutal, sort of cold thing to do. Anyone who looks at the program and expects that by cutting a U.S. Treasury trick, you're going to make 9/11 families happy is vastly misunderstanding what's going on with this program. There's not one family member I've met who wouldn't gladly give back the check, or in many cases their own lives, to have that loved one back.
Wow.
Happy never enters into the equation."
Yeah.
In other words, what he's saying is this: their value ultimately isn't based on the value of their production, but it's the value of those relationships.
Okay, now
they mattered because of who they mattered to.
Yeah. Now I feel like we're getting closer to a biblical understanding of humanity.
We are, because ultimately the value of a human being is going to be found in our relationship to God. And of course, to explain that, we have to start with the story of creation.
Okay. I expected you actually start there instead of Numbers, and it wasn't the book of Numbers, but Numbers. So at some point, here we are. We're at creation. Take it from there.
The story of creation firmly roots humanity in the plan of God from the beginning of our story. But to understand the significance of our creation story, I want to compare it to other stories of creation. Most cultures that we've uncovered in the ancient world all had their own creation stories. Stories that would tell where they thought the world came from, where they thought humanity had a place in that world, and typically in those stories, they would defend the power structures of the culture that story came out of. So for example, the Babylonian creation story tells the story of creation through a cosmic battle between the gods and a monster who represents chaos, and it ends with the explanation of why Babylon should be in charge, because Babylon's god, Marduk, was the one who won that right by leading the war. He in turn creates humanity to serve the gods by relieving them of their suffering because humanity takes on their work. The Greek creation stories also begin with chaos and an eventual battle of the gods that leads to the hero myth, the demigods, who in turn tie into the noble families of Greece. So if you want to know why some Greeks are noble and some aren't, it's because they could tie their family lineage going all the way back to one of these demigods. In Egypt, you have a story again of creation coming out of a watery chaos called Nu, out of which arises a pyramid-shaped mound. And this is where creation begins. But where that mound was found always changed based on which city in Egypt was in charge. So the story changes based on whether it's Hermopolis, whether it's Memphis, whether it's Thebes. Basically, whoever is in charge tells the story in such a way as to justify why they should be in charge. My favorite example comes from China. In China, you have a creation story of the goddess Nua, who actually fights the chaos. Again, here's fighting the chaos by basically dealing with the damage that occurs when heaven collapses and all the waters hit the earth. Out of that, she creates humanity to serve as her slaves. And initially, Nua takes the clay and she forms each human slave individually. But she gets tired of doing that over time, so she dips her cloak in the clay, and then she just waves it over the ground, and it falls into little clumps of mud, and that becomes the start of a whole nother set of human beings. And in the Chinese myth, the noble families of China are the descendants of those humans who were carefully crafted by Nua, whereas the peasants are the descendants of those humans who simply come from those globs of clay. So in other words, creation stories around the world have a tendency to explain creation as a fight between the gods and some representation of chaos, with the winning God assuming ascendancy over other peoples, that in turn justifies, or the ascendancy over other gods, that in turn justifies the ascendancy of one people over other peoples. And many times in those stories, when humanity is created, it's also to serve as slaves to gods, and in turn, humanity is sometimes differentiated that these human beings should have authority over these human beings because they were created differently. So, if you understand that, if you look at these creation stories, then you come to the story in Genesis. And right away, you're struck by what's different. There isn't some kind of cosmic battle against chaos, but rather God doesn't have any equals. God doesn't have any competitors. God's Spirit simply hovers over the watery chaos. And as the breath of God, he carries the Word of God, so that when God begins to create, he just speaks. And what happens is he builds a structure. He separates light from dark. Here's a structure. He separates the waters above from the waters below. Here's a structure. He separates the waters from land. Then he fills that with life. He ends by creating human beings not to serve as his slaves, but to serve as his co-regents over creation. That we are called, created in the image of God, to serve represent his authority over creation. And in that story, all human life comes from the same parents, which means there's no one group of human beings that have some kind of natural ascendancy over others. Even the calling of Israel later in Scripture is meant to be a calling to serve other people groups, not just God making one people more special than everybody else.
So is the story of creation also meant to be a story of human equality?
Here's what I would say. We should read the story of creation as a story in which God has no competitors. God has no equal. And because God has no equal, all of creation comes from the will of God, including all of humanity. Humanity has equality because God has no equal. And in a sense, because God does not value one human being over another, all human beings find their value in relationship to God and to each other as the image of God.
So in my Christian journey, from early years in Sunday school to latter years as superintendent, I've always lived and taught and preached on that humans were created in the image of God. What's that mean?
I think how we answer that question, what does the image of God means, answers all the other questions, right? It answers what it means to be human. It answers what it means for the value of humanity. It answers what it means for how we should treat one another. And I would argue that, you come to Genesis 1, 26 and 27, and it says, let us make mankind in our image and our likeness, so they may rule over the fish in the sea, the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, over all the creatures that move along the ground. And right away you get the sense that whatever it means for God to say, let us create in our image, is somehow connected to human call to rule over creation, over the rest of created life. Now, in the ancient world, kings were sometimes justified in their authority by being said to be the image of the god of whatever land they were ruling over. And sometimes images were actually set up in particular towns as a way to say, here's under whose authority this town is. So in light of all of that, when you read the story in Genesis, you're reading it not as some human beings having authority over others, but all of humanity is created to represent God's authority to the rest of creation, and it's an authority that we share by our common humanity. Now, the first command God ever gives to humanity is to what? Be fruitful and multiply in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea, the birds in the sky, over every living creature that moves on the ground. In other words, if we're created in God's image, then we're created to represent God's rule and care over creation. To do that, we have to fill creation. We have to be wherever creation is. To do that, we have to be fruitful and multiply. And to do that, we have to be male and female together. So all of this is part of our vocation of what it means to be human.
Is there more? Is there more to being in the image of God than that? What do you do with free will?
There are three popular interpretations of what it means to be God's image throughout church history. The first, sometimes called today the substantive view, may be the most popular theory of what it means to be God's image, and it simply argues that there's something about us as human beings that is reflective of God, but is unique to us. Something that we have that's not shared by the rest of creation, but still reflects God. And everyone pretty much agrees that whatever that capacity or ability is, it's not something located in our physical bodies. So it's not the idea that, well, we have two arms and God has two arms. It's something that has to be internal to us. And so many people have argued either that eternal capacity is reason, so that we have an ability to think that goes beyond the rest of creation. God is the highest intelligence in the universe, and what reflects his image in us is our intelligence. Others have said, no, it's free will, that God is the most free being in the universe, and that what reflects the image in us is freedom. But however we view it, one of the problems with this is there are some human beings who just don't have the same capacity towards reason or towards freedom that others do. Say, those who are developmentally disabled, and you don't want to define the image of God in such a way that you leave those people out. Okay. Another view that takes seriously the idea that God created male and female together in his image. And it argues that in order to be the image of God, we have to be able to relate to God and to others in a unique way. This is called the relational view. Our ability to be relational to God and especially to one another is in a sense what defines us as the image of God. God as Trinity is relational as his essence. God has always existed in relationship. And if humanity is created in the image of God as male and female, then that means God's image also exists in relationship. And being male and female it implies our ability to fill the earth as God's image. Now, a potential problem with this is that not everyone's capable of relating to each other in the same way. So if we're going to argue for a relational view, it has to still be grounded in God's ability to relate to us, not just our ability to relate to each other. And then the third view is one I've already described. It's the functional view, which is the idea that the image of God is found in our calling as human beings to represent his authority and care over creation. So the image of God is what we're called to do as God's image. So the substantive view, what we're called to be; the relational view, how we're called to relate; the functional view here, what we're called to do, that we're called to have dominion over creation. We find this in the Genesis account. We also find it in Psalms 8, 5-8. And this call to exercise dominion is understood more in terms of stewardship. We're not exercising dominion as if we are God, but as if we're representing God. Some theologians even connect this to what they've called a cultural mandate, which is the idea that we're to learn about and guide creation as God's representatives, in the same way that Christ sent apostles out to the nations to guide them as his representatives. Now, a potential problem with this is how we misunderstand the word dominion, so that we treat it as an excuse to exploit the world, or that our role as a church is to dominate culture rather than serve creation. So we have these multiple interpretations, all of them come with potential problems.
All right, I'm sitting here thinking, which view do I embrace? And I like truths from each one of them. Do I have to choose one over the other, or is there a fourth that's sort of a mix of all three?
When I would teach this to my class, my classes in school, I would always have students who would struggle with this very same question. They're like, well, I like this part of this, I like this part of that. And typically I would have them vote. And I would say, I want you to vote on, how many of you, if you had to choose, would choose, substantive, you would choose relational, you would choose functional. Then I would have them defend their vote, which would always lead to this great discussion in class on why are you choosing to define humanity in this way? But in the end, I would then say, if I gave you the option of combining them together, how many of you would choose that? And at that point, most hands would go up. And I'd say there is a way to bring all of these views together. And I would go back to the board and I would slowly write on the board, J-E-S-U-S. In the New Testament, Jesus is also called the image of God, 2 Corinthians 4:4, Colossians 1:15, which we sometimes take as, well, of course he's the image of God. I mean, he's God in the flesh. But understand, we as human beings were created in the image of God. Jesus reveals to us the image of God. So we can say that Jesus as the image of God actually shows us what it means to be humans created in the image of God. And there's certainly calls in the New Testament for us as Christians to be found in the image of Christ. So Romans 8:29 through 30, or 1 Corinthians 15:49. Colossians 3:10 says that our new self is being renewed in knowledge in the image of its creator. In other words, our conformity to the image of Jesus is showing us what it means to be human, created in the image of God. The more I'm becoming like Jesus, the more I'm becoming what God always intended me to be. Now, some theologians, people like Stanley Grentz, I'm just going to throw out some names here, John Kellner, Mark Cortez, have argued that when it comes to understanding the image of God, typically in the church we do it backwards. We usually begin with the meaning of the image of God for us, so relational, substantive, functional view. Then we try to explain how Christ fulfills that as the image of God as a human being. What they argue is we should begin with who Jesus is as the image of God, and then explain humanity in light of Jesus. Because of Jesus, we have a special relatedness to God as human beings, not just as Christians, but humanity showed itself capable of bearing the presence of God in the incarnation. Because of Jesus, we know that we are called to reflect God to the created order. Romans 8:21 even tells us that all of creation is awaiting our salvation so creation itself can be saved.
Okay, so how does knowing Jesus in the image of God bring all of these three views together? You probably said it, but I need you to unpack that.
Okay, so the substantive view tells us that humanity is called to be reasonable, right? That there's some capacity that we have that reflects God's image, but Jesus is revealed to us as the Logos of God, as the reason of God, as the one who reveals the wisdom of God, which means that when we come to Jesus, we actually come to know God and to know his creation in a better way. The relational view tells us that humanity is called to be relational. But it's Christ who reveals the love of God as the way to the Father. His life and his lifestyle actually show us how to be in healthy relationship with God and with each other. Paul in Philippians 2:5, when he tells us that you need to be like Jesus, be like-minded, it's all about relationship. He describes the incarnation. Though he was in the very being, though he was equal with God, he didn't consider his equality with God as something to be exploited. But he found himself in the likeness of human beings, obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Why is he explaining this to us? Because he wants us to have the same mind for our relationships. The functional view also tells us that humanity is called to be responsible, that we are called to care for creation. What does Jesus do? He reflects the authority of God over creation as the Lord who now sits at God's right hand. And we're told that one day we as human beings will reign with Christ even judging angels. And so we're called to care for creation and one another. So in Christ Jesus, we understand how to be reasonable, we understand how to be relational, we understand how to be responsible. Okay. Jesus also teaches us how to be redeemed. He shows us what it means to be human as the resurrection and the life. So I've said before, he's the Logos of God, he's the Lord over creation, he reveals the love of God to us, but he's also our life. And in the resurrection, we see our destiny, the destiny that God intends for all human beings, a destiny that's not controlled or corrupted by sin, that's not controlled by death, but a destiny that is set free by God once and for all. Jesus shows us what humanity is called to be as the image of God. Jesus, as God in the flesh, was able to live in the limitations of human flesh. He lived in time and space in one place at one time. He experienced human needs like hunger, need for sleep. And in light of those limitations, he was also able to be tempted. So one thing I like to highlight when I look at Jesus is if he had human limitations and those weren't sinful, us living in our limitations also aren't sinful or wrong. That I, as a human being, cannot be everywhere all at once. Right. And I know as General Superintendent, sometimes you're expected to be everywhere all at once, but you can't be. That I, as a human being, have needs, physical needs that I have to take care of, that I have to be aware of the temptations that are going to come my way because of those needs and our desires. Jesus experienced all of that, but he did it without sin, which means he showed us. Now here's the thing. He was fully human and he never sinned. That means that sin is not a part of our humanity. Sin doesn't reflect our humanity. Sin is a corruption of our humanity. And through his work, our humanity can be fully redeemed from the power of sin, from the fear of death, because that is what God has intended for human beings all along. To be Christian or to be discipled in the Christian faith isn't about trying to make someone more religious. It's about guiding people in their calling as human beings to live out their lives fully in the way that God intended, for his glory, but also for their good. When we become more like Jesus, we're actually becoming more like ourselves. So Christianity isn't a way of being religious, it's a way of being human.
To all of our viewers, I want to give you permission to just pause, rewind about 5 minutes, and listen to this section again and again. If I were summarizing what we've just heard, it would be something like this. God created humanity to equally share in his calling as God's image over creation. And that Jesus shows what it means to be in God's image over creation as Logos of God, or the love of God revealed by the cross and Lord over creation. Jesus redeems humanity from sin to set us free to be fully who God has called us to be and created us to be, which is who we really are to begin with. In other words, our identity is found in Jesus. Man, that's gold. Dr.
And I'll say,
Tennison.
we could have saved a lot of time if I just summed it up your way. Our identity is found in Jesus.
Yeah.
But something else I want to add is that because we were created in the image of God, it means we were made to reflect God, which means we were also made to worship God. Because whatever you revere, you will also reflect or resemble. Great New Testament scholar G.K. Beale put it this way in the title of his book. He says, we become what we worship. We eventually become what we worship. And if you worship anything that is less than God, you're actually living beneath your own humanity as someone created in God's image, because now you're reflecting something less than God by your worship. So today we live in a time where we've tried to put to death all gods, at least in the Western world, so that what happens is what we're living in light of is just ourselves. That we become images not of God, but images of ourselves as the objects of our worship. And when that happens, we become enslaved to self. So follow along here. We're called to be reasonable, to understand who God is and what the world is in light of Jesus as the Logos of God. But when we choose ourselves over Christ, rather than becoming reasonable, we just become self-conscious. Instead of becoming more relational by following the love of God as revealed in Jesus, we become marked by self-reliance that avoids dependence on others. Instead of becoming more responsible as followers of the Lord Jesus, we start becoming more self-centered as if our own happiness is what we mainly have responsibility for. And instead of becoming redeemed by trusting in Jesus as the resurrection and the life, we become stuck with self-fulfillment, and we can only receive whatever we do for ourselves. That's living out our humanity beneath what God has for us. We become self-conscious, we become self-fulfilled, we become self-centered, and all these ways we're becoming enslaved by self rather than being free to reflect God.
You said at the beginning, many of the ethical debates in culture today have come from either a lack of understanding or a false understanding of what it means to be human. I think we can see more clearly that if you take God out of the equation of what it means to be human, then you're never going to get to the true understanding of human value. Is that true?
Yeah, we're made to reflect God. All human beings have a shared dignity as beings created in God's image, and all human beings have worth as being created in God's image. All of humanity is God's image to the rest of creation, but we're not God's image over each other as if I represent God to you in a way that you don't also represent God to me. I don't have power over you in this way. It takes that away from us. The fact that God became enfleshed in the person of Jesus probably says more about the value of human beings than anything, because the humanity of Jesus served as a tabernacle for the presence of God. John 1:14, the Word, the Logos, became flesh and made his tabernacle among us. At the same time, we don't only have this kind of value and worth, we have a shared responsibility as those who are created in God's image. The command to subdue the earth is a command to take charge over it, not as God, but as God's stewards of what remains his. Our vocation as human beings is a responsibility towards God, and Jesus shows us what that vocation looks like and the way that he cares for us. At the same time, we're all embodied as beings created in God's image. The way he created us in the physical world to be his image is to give us physicality. We're not just spirits using bodies, but as the image of God in bodies by which we are able to interact with his creation. Otherwise, we couldn't bear responsibility for it. And no interpretation of what it means to be human that doesn't take seriously our bodies can be a complete interpretation. Even God's promise to us in Jesus, our final destiny, is a promise that includes the resurrection of our bodies. So what that means for us in terms of value and ethics is that we have to care for our bodies and we have to care for each other's bodies as much as we do our souls, because it all matters to God. As human beings, we matter to God, and so we have to matter to each other. And wherever we find human beings not being treated as if they matter, or not being treated as if their bodies matter, we have a church that must speak out, because that goes against our faith, and that actually violates our teaching of Jesus.
I think I understand now why you called this one of the most important conversations. And I want to challenge our viewers. I think if we grasp this, it will impact not only our evangelism, but our discipleship. In fact, I hope you as a viewer, first of all, know how much you matter to God. And when you do, you can help other people understand how much they matter to God. That God loved you so much that he gave his only son for you. You are eternally valued. So my prayer is that the truth of understanding humanity from this biblical perspective will help you grow in your understanding of who God's called and created you to be and your divine purpose. But secondly, you'll be able to help other people who are made in God's image to understand that truth too. Thank you, Dr. Tennison, for impacting us today with this teaching.
Thank you.